Hi everyone, I'm Abby Wolf, I'm the Executive Director of the Huggins Center. It's a pleasure to welcome you back and see some new faces here. So yesterday Rebecca Scott started us out on a kind of fascinating journey and mystery, and today she will continue on with that. So I personally can't wait. I want to introduce David Armitage, who will be introducing her. He's the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History and the Chair of the Department of History here at Harvard. So thank you very much for coming. Enjoy.
Thank you. The seasons turn and Rebecca Scott returns. It's an absolute delight to welcome Rebecca back again. I was here on this podium not so many months ago. I think it was April, perhaps, earlier this year, when she and Jean Hébrard were here for a magnificent event to launch their equally magnificent book, which I'm sure everyone has already read. If you have not, rush out, buy it, press it into the hands of all your friends and family. Remarkable work from a remarkable historian, and it really is always a pleasure to welcome old friends back to Harvard, but a particular pleasure to welcome Rebecca back to give the second of these Huggins lectures today. As I think you all know very well, but I'll remind you just because it's such a pleasure to recall these achievements. Rebecca is the Charles Gibson Distinguished Professor of History and also Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. Among her many honors over the years are a Guggenheim Fellowship and a MacArthur Fellowship. She's most recently also been a visiting scholar at Yale Law School, very appropriately, since so many of her contributions, her historical contributions, are also contributions to the history of law, the history of rights, the history of property, and their relations to larger histories, histories of migration and movement, but also more intimate histories, the histories of bodies and persons and conceptions of persons, how persons conceive themselves, how in the passive construction they are perceived by others, put into grids, but how those grids can also become ladders, forms of escape, means of negotiation out and through some of the knots and twists of the legal orders which increasingly thickened and spanned the Atlantic world of the very long 19th century. As I mentioned, Freedom Papers has won its very fair share of glory. Among those signs of its glorious passage through our intellectual life are recently the award of the Beveridge Prize and also the Raleigh Prize of the AHA and the Chinard Prize of the Society for French Historical Studies. You are not here to hear me, but I thought a nice transition might be for me to read just 4 sentences from this book in my own voice so that you can begin to hear a little of Rebecca's voice as I pass over the podium to its rightful occupant now. These are just a few lines from the end of the first chapter of Freedom Papers to give you a taste or to remind you of Rebecca's remarkable historical voice and extraordinary sensitivity, but also the suggestiveness of her formulations. Papers not only recorded crucial information for those engaged in commerce or formal study. Paper not only recorded crucial information for those engaged in commerce or formal study, it could in a quite different mode serve as the basis for a talisman or an amulet, something to provide protection in times of difficulty. Words could protect and words could enslave. The young woman who is soon to be called Eulalie, the central figure in this book, of course, may or may not have seen the documents that were exchanged between the captain of the ship and the trader who held her in captivity prior to her sale at the warehouse or on the wharf in Saint Louis. The knowledge that writing confers power may nonetheless have accompanied her as she began her journey, leaving beyond any claim to rights as a member of the Pulaar nation and heading toward the colonial society where she would be registered as property. I think we all recognize that voice, that combination of the intimate and the exact with the extraordinary wide-ranging and the suggestive. And we will hear more of this in the real voice of Rebecca Scott very shortly. Rebecca, welcome back. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's actually quite difficult to give a talk after having been billed in quite that way. I'm not sure my voice is as ringing as David Armitage makes it out to be, but I will try to live up to expectations. I'm delighted to be here for the second of these 3 lectures. I again thank Henry Louis Gates and Abby Wolf and the staff of the Du Bois Institute of the Hutchins Center and David Armitage himself for their gracious welcome. So, as those of you who were here yesterday know, and as the others of you will probably have inferred, the lectures center in different ways on the question, what made someone a slave? What, in effect, was the root of the title by which a person could claim another person as property? Yesterday, we looked at the history of the freeborn child named Sanitte, examining the way in which a right of property in her person came to be fabricated. With the creation of written depositions, the stitching of a signature on a piece of paper, and finally, as you recall, the trip to a public notary to create a sale document that would serve as the first link in an ever stronger chain of title. And as you also recall, Sanitte's story stands in as a kind of emblem of the fate of at least the 3,226 persons who were part of the Saint-Domingue diaspora arriving as refugees in New Orleans and who were categorized as slaves upon arrival. And as you know, they'd been in exile since their flight from Saint-Domingue at the time of the Napoleonic effort to crush the power of Toussaint Louverture and the black generals who were ruling that colony in the name of France. But as we also mentioned yesterday, in addition to those more than 3,000 persons who were categorized as slaves, another 3,000 were categorized as free-colored and black people, to use the phrase of the mayor's report. So by what means had such people hung on to the category free, and were they at risk of losing that designation? So yesterday we speculated a certain amount about Marthe Boyer, the person who carried out much of the enslavement of Sanitte, along with Louis Pomponneau. And today we'll turn it around and look at someone whom we know to have been categorized as free upon arrival, and at the risk that her freedom would not, in fact, prove to be durable. The second story begins, like the first, in Cap Français, there on the northern coast of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, fairly close to the border with Spanish Santo Domingo. The child named Adélaïde, or Adelaide, who is the figure we will follow today, was born to an enslaved woman who was owned by a tailor named Charles Métayer. We do not know who Adelaide's father was. A neighbor, actually it was Louis Pomponneau, now that some of you who were here yesterday have gotten to know Louis Pomponneau, so a neighbor, Louis Pomponneau, once asked Charles Métayer whether Adelaide was his daughter. And Métayer replied that she was his slave, which of course is not exactly an answer to the question. She was usually designated a mulâtresse, which would imply that she was viewed as being of mixed African and European ancestry, but in other documents she's referred to as a négresse, implying that she was viewed as being black. The terminology changes depending on the circumstance. So, as you all know, 1791, the huge uprising of slaves in Saint-Domingue's northern plain near Cap Français. 2 years later, while Adélaïde was still a child, the French civil commissioners, Paul Vérel and Sonthonax, decided, faced with, and with Julia Gaffield sitting right in my field of vision, I hesitate to try to summarize this enormously complex question, but I'll try this summary. Faced with multiple threats from the Spanish trying to move in on the French colony, from the rebel forces themselves, from the general instability of French rule, and competition with the recently arrived French general François Thomas Galbaud, who posed a threat to the civil commissioner's authority, they took the dramatic step of calling upon free people of color and persons held as slaves who were in rebellion, and promising that such persons, if they assisted in the campaign to support the civil commissioners, would become free. So the dramatic declaration was made that freedom was on the way. As many of you know, in the combat that followed, the city of Cap Français was burned, and thousands of its residents became refugees of the particular. It's a complex process of being a refugee, because it can involve either a fear of the events that are unfolding, or it can involve a direct flight from the flames. So we probably shouldn't impute specific beliefs to the people who scrambled to get on boats in the harbor. And Charles Métayer, the tailor, and his household were among those who clambered onto a boat in order to flee Cap Français. He and his wife took the young Adélaïde with them as they and their son made their way into exile in New York City. So before any formal legal enforcement of the promised abolition had actually taken effect in the tumult of fire and flight, Adélaïde was removed from the jurisdiction of the civil commissioners and removed out of Saint-Domingue. Her legal status was probably completely undefined. We don't know how she may have been listed on a passenger list. I think it's probably fair to say that the métayers simply regarded her as a slave. There'd be relatively little reason for them to think of her otherwise. They arrive in New York. So the state of New York has not at this point abolished slavery. And so port authorities were very unlikely to raise any objections when foreign immigrants arrive accompanied by a person whom they simply designate or treat as their slave. I've looked for traces of the family in New York City. I think I might be able to find some more. I've found one. Charles Métayer and his wife Catherine stood as godparents to the baptism of a child on December 25th, 1794, in St. Peter's Church. So 1794, we know that the household is there in New York. 1794, we also know that back in Saint-Domingue, the actions of the Revolutionary Civil Commissioners are taking effect, and that the National Assembly, the National Convention in Paris is going to ratify that abolition of slavery. Again, many of you who are familiar with the history of the Haitian Revolution already know this, but it's a crucial piece of the backdrop. Slavery is gone in Saint-Domingue as a legal status, both by the action of the Civil Commissioners and by the action of the French National Convention. So, effective power in the north of the colony is gradually going to come to be in the hands of Toussaint Louverture and his allies in the name of what was now the French Republic. Now, as many of you know, Toussaint Louverture did impose various labor constraints, but he also stood by the principle of abolition. Hence, the point that I would make is that the legal category is gone. The actual practice of coerced labor persists in various forms. Now, one thing that I hadn't realized until I began tracking the Métayer family was the extent to which many of the Saint-Domingue refugees of this period who found themselves in places like New York were actually eager to go back to Saint-Domingue. Again, we have to kind of break with our image of émigrés as people who necessarily hate revolutions and never want to go back. In fact, you can tell by reading the Gazette Française from New York that people are advertising that there's passage on certain boats under a flag of truce. I found a hardware store owner who's advertising that he has seeds for sale that are particularly appropriate for the soil of Saint-Domingue. In other words, clearly as we roll toward 1799, 1800, 1801, people who have been torn away from their landed property and their occupations and the houses they owned in Le Cap are seriously considering returning. Toussaint is, after all, ruling in the name of France. It's not necessarily already the Haitian Revolution of fantasy and fear, although it has elements of that. So, various bateaux parlementaires were leaving for Saint-Domingue. The notice was published in the newspaper that if you were a refugee from Saint-Domingue, you could go to the French consulate, you could get a passport, and you could return. And this is what the Métayers do. They return with their household to Saint-Domingue. Now, what did they imagine would be the status of Adélaïde as they now entered a jurisdiction in which there was no slavery? Now, and also, what did they imagine was coming down the pike in New York if they stayed? By 1799, New York has passed a gradual abolition law. It's clear what the direction of change is going to be. It doesn't affect any adults. It only affects newborn children at this point. But in a sense, slavery is ending also in the place where they are, as well as having ended in the place that they're headed to. So the Métayers' removal of Adélaïde from the state probably proceeded without obstacle, because as yet New York law doesn't prohibit that. It still recognizes property in adult persons. So they arrive back in Cap Français. Now the Métayer family, French descent, find themselves in a colony governed by men of color in which slavery's been abolished. in which multiple forms of labor control are nonetheless in place. And I suspect it's a good bet that they imagined that these labor regulations would be sufficient, if to the extent that they knew about it, to continue to oblige Adélaïde to remain within their household. And one of the neighbors from Cap Français, in a later lawsuit that I'll talk about in a moment, was asked to explain what the situation was when they returned. And she recalled that there were regulations under Toussaint Louverture that required identity cards from domestic workers. So here's how the neighbor tried to explain it to a sort of kind of half puzzled and half dissimulating Louisiana court. So here's what she said. She said, Adélaïde lived with her mistress at the Cape, Le Cap, and served her there as all other Negroes did. And she goes on to say, and as my Negroes did. She's describing people whom she continued to employ as domestics in whatever form this is. And then she says, at that time, Negroes, though not called slaves, at that time in Saint Domingo, meaning Saint-Domingue, were nevertheless obliged to live with the persons to whom they'd formerly belonged, and during a period, cards of safety, as they were then called, were required from them, that is to say, certificates of their having complied with that order. It's not exactly an accurate description because people didn't actually have to remain with the persons to whom they had belonged, unless the persons to whom they belonged were elderly or infants, but they did have to remain in someone's service as domestics. Now, so we can sort of see Adélaïde returning and caught within this web of labor regulations, but also able to see around her in this jurisdiction how many people are no longer slaves, how many women are moving about in the streets of Cap Français as merchant women, as traders. And Adélaïde, by this point, we now know, conceives of a strategy for moving out of whatever that situation of constraint is that she's in and into the liberté that she sees around her. So, a formal freedom paper, here it's worth pointing out, a formal freedom paper, a manumission document, is completely impossible by this point. Because since there's no property, there can't be in persons, there can't be a legal extinction of property in persons, right? You can't say, if I don't recognize your ownership of property in her, I can't really have you come and file a document that says I am her owner and I hereby free her. So a legal manumission paper isn't possible. So instead, what happened was Adélaïde volunteered to pay money to Charles Métayer in installments. And when she paid the last installment, Charles Métayer called in two of his neighbors as witnesses, and he prepared a piece of paper that acknowledged Adélaïde's payment of 306 gourdes. This is obviously not the original, this is my transcription. We don't have the original, and I'll tell you in a few minutes why we don't have the original. But this is my transcription of a copy of it. So it's somewhat approximate spelling. Je reconnais avoir reçu d'Adélaïde Métayer Mulatresse, she's 20 years old, 306 gourdes, pour avoir acheté sa liberté qu'elle a payée en 3 reprises. So she's purchased her liberty, which she has paid in 3 installments. Now, it's a document under private signature. It doesn't have a notarized seal on it, but it is a kind of written proof of liberté. I won't quite say freedom because it's a proof of liberté, and Adélaïde kept it with her for years and years. But it has a catch. She had recently given birth to a child, and at the time of this transaction, Charles Métayer said that he did not want to release the little boy to her. He apparently proposed to do so later as an act of generosity, what he called an act of generosity. So the child is not referred to in the receipt. The child is already born, but is not referred to in the receipt. You can hold the detail in mind. So she now has a piece of paper that certifies her liberté. She went to work in the town of Port-de-Paix. We know that she lived with a woman named Claire and that she worked as a marchande, a woman engaged in trading. She then returned to Le Cap, and I assume to recuperate her child, but I don't know. And she set up housekeeping with a man who worked in the lime kilns. So she was living with a working class man. So her situation was probably well, stable may not be the right word, but she had achieved some kind of modus vivendi. Charles Métayer made no claim over her. She had an intimate partner. She almost certainly had her child back with her. But this was all going to be upset by geopolitics. 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte sent an expeditionary force from France to the colony of Saint-Domingue with orders to oblige Toussaint Louverture and the other black generals to submit to the will of the first consul. Now, depending on which interpretation you have of Napoleon, you can either interpret this as his rage at the Constitution, at his fury at Toussaint's semi-independent foreign policy, or his absolute commitment to the reimposition of slavery, or some combination of those three. In any event, it was clearly an effort to break the power of the persons then in power, and the final battle, in effect, was now joined. The revolution that had at an early stage seemed to be for liberty and equality under French rule, now became a war against French authority, relatively late in the day, 1802. Tenacious resistance by persons who realized the magnitude of Napoleon's insistence on restoring slavery, combined with the epidemiological trauma to French soldiers of the rainy season in a tropical region and the illness that carried, weakened the Napoleonic expeditionary force in the face of the opposition of those who were not going to allow the reimposition of slavery. And the colony was consumed in fire and war. So again, we're going to see a moment of flight of refugees, but again, it's useful to recall that it's some combination of people who are leaving because the French are losing and people who are leaving because it's a very terrifying place to be on a field of battle. And so again, we probably cannot impute a single motive to refugees. By the spring of 1803, war also resumed in Europe between England and France. As Dessalines' forces were advancing against the French, the British blockaded the ports of the colony, thus offering the French troops basically two options. They could surrender to the British or they could surrender to Dessalines. French soldiers were soon in absolutely full-scale retreat. And as the fighting reached these last redoubts of French control, you also had a wave of civilians leaving. So you have the tumbling departure of soldiers. You also have civilians fleeing the war zone, hoping to make their way to some safe haven. But it's particularly difficult to do that because the British are all over the place in the water. And so a ship trying to leave Saint-Domingue can be seized by the British Navy. It can be seized by a privateer as a prize of war, or it can make it through to Santiago, Cuba. But this is one reason why so many people sometimes ask me, well, why did they go to Cuba? And I sort of show the map, right? So you're trying to get out, and the waters are filled with British ships. You'd best take your shortest hop, which is to eastern Cuba. So we have people fleeing, and some of them are going to end up in the hands of the British and are going to end up in Kingston, Jamaica. And this, by what means we're not certain, this is what happened to Adélaïde Métayer. It's also what happened apparently to Madame Métayer, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So, Governor Nugent of Jamaica, who was well aware of what was happening in the adjacent colony, as these refugees arrived, first of all, he didn't want them there in the first place. He allowed a few officers to be free in Kingston and to have dinner with himself and Lady Nugent. But in general, he wasn't very happy about having French soldiers, and he was not very happy about having French civilians. He was particularly unhappy about having French civilians who were persons of color, and he was very unhappy about having civilians whom he believed to be slaves, because he doesn't feel himself under any obligation to acknowledge the abolition that's happened in the adjacent colony. So, Nugent simply describes them as slaves. There's no process of adjudication. That's just what he calls them. And he administers measures to try to hasten their incarceration, their sale, or their deportation. So Adélaïde and her son are among the many refugees of all colors and conditions who landed in Jamaica. But was she going to be seen as slave or free?
So 2 years earlier, she'd bought her way out of labor duties. She'd been a free marchande. Her neighbors would know that. Usually designated mulâtresse, with a child who was designated mulâtre. She would seem to be a reasonable candidate for categorization as a free colored woman in the Jamaican parlance, even by British authorities otherwise unsympathetic with abolition. Her social presentation could match that of a social category well known in Kingston. Elevation to the category free person of color at this particular moment in Kingston, however, was a mixed blessing, because free persons of color were viewed as exceptionally dangerous people to be in the slaveholding colony of Jamaica. And so Nugent ordered many or most of them, the ones he couldn't get out fast enough, he ordered them to simply be put on prison ships in the harbor. Some of you probably remember in Great Expectation, the hulks, the great big empty ships out in a harbor where prisoners are put. So out on these hulks, which my image of them is Dickensian, right? On these hulks are privateers, pirates, French soldiers who are ill, and free persons of color whom Governor Nugent thinks he'd better not allow to stay in Kingston. So being designated a free woman of color, you've got a child in your arms, those hulks are really almost certainly not where you want to be. So independent of categories, it's not where you want to be. So the British colonial, so we leave a question mark there about her status. The British colonial government did not institute any formal process for making distinctions of status, as far as I know. I would love to find a little bundle of lawsuits, but neither Julia Gaffield nor I have ever come across anything. Vince? No? Yeah, it would be, but I think the basic view was a kind of, these people are here for a while, but we'd like them to leave as soon as possible. We're not actually going to draw them into our legal system. And also because the designation as slave was one that he made sweepingly. So he treated, I think, the categories slave and free colored as kind of self-evident, and the abolition decrees from Saint-Domingue as just immaterial. So that, in a sense, solved the question for him. But as alarm about a possible insurrection instigated by refugees began to circulate, there were always rumors of unknown persons from Saint-Domingue speaking French showing up on a plantation. Governor Nugent then took steps to send some of the refugees back to now independent Haiti, ruled by Dessalines, and others out to New Orleans. But a few refugees were able to obtain permission to remain in Jamaica, each on the recommendation of two freeholders of the colony. And here, I don't know for certain, but I sense it's people who, when they arrived, already knew someone who was there, so that instead of being in the undifferentiated mass of refugees, they moved into a household of some kind. And a list was drawn up of persons allowed to remain, along with this is the phrase at the top of the list, the names of the female French slaves that such persons wish to retain in their service and are approved by the committee. Female slaves being viewed as less likely to be insurrectionary than male. And when I found that list in Kingston, I had gone to work in the Nugent papers knowing that there was no chance I would find one single refugee in the governor's papers, because she would not be worthy of the attention of the governor with the massive problems he had. Julia knows this, box after box, page after page, and you get this little list of people allowed to remain, and you go down the list, and boom, there's Catherine Métayer, the wife of Charles the tailor. And then you run your finger across the line, and it says, 3 slaves named Adélaïde, Louise, and child Alzire. So at least on this piece of paper, it appears that Adélaïde's status, which she has held as free, has now reverted to that of slave. So when I first found this, my first question was, wait, how did that happen? So then here we get into the speculative part. So she was in Le Cap. It's complete chaos with a retreat and an advancing army. And she's got a child, and nobody knows quite what's going to happen next, and people don't really know what to expect from Dessalines. And so she needs to get out. She feels she needs to get out. Well, you couldn't get out unless you could pay your passage on a boat, and probably in some cases you couldn't even get passage on a boat unless you knew somebody who knew when to go and where to go. So she needed to somehow hold custody over her son, find money for passage. Maybe she needed allies to find a place on a boat. And as far as I can infer, her former mistress, Madame Métayer, is also trying to leave. Whether intentionally for Jamaica or not, we don't know. We don't know if they get on a boat that says it's going to Kingston, or if they get on a boat that says it's going to Santiago and then it's picked up and taken to Kingston. So we can't know, or actually we can't know, we don't know yet how and when Madame Métayer and Adélaïde come to be seen again as mistress and slave. Who offered or extorted what from whom and why. So all we really know is that Adélaïde makes it onto the boat with her son and her passage is paid. So then we come forward some number of months. Madame Métayer, who has kin, I think, in Jamaica, Catherine Métayer, is petitioning for permission to stay. She doesn't want to be tumbled out again as a refugee. And at that point, showing herself to have access to the labor of 3 slaves is probably something in her favor because it makes it less likely that she'll be a charge on the parish, that she'll be a burden to the government. So it also means that Adélaïde will not be sent to the hulks. So we don't know. We can only imagine what's happening right there. Now, within a matter of months, as far as we can tell, whatever this link was that had been reestablished between Madame Métayer and Adélaïde is broken. And Adélaïde moves on. She continues with the large stream of refugees who are unwelcome in Jamaica and are going to Cuba. At this point, she's pregnant with her 2nd child. She leaves Jamaica and she lands on the coast of Cuba. She lands not in Santiago, where the drama we talked about yesterday had taken place, with Sanitte, but instead in the much smaller port city of Baracoa, fairly isolated from Santiago, only really connected at this period by boat. This is relevant because it means there's much less Spanish administration in the town and there are a lot of privateers. It's the kind of port city tucked out there into the Caribbean that keeps good contact with places that it's not supposed to. Lots of contrabanding, lots of privateering. She was apparently in the company of a male companion, Monsieur Bernoulli, and she fairly quickly became integrated into the community of French refugees in Baracoa. So, what's her status? Here we're trying again to figure out status. People in this small community knew quite a lot about each other. And we know that at one point, Adélaïde got into a quarrel with Mimi Boulard, one of her neighbors. And Mimi, in the heat of the quarrel, referred to Adélaïde as a slave. Now, that moment of denunciation was obviously meant to be humiliating. That was the purpose of saying it. But it was also, of course, for Adélaïde, very dangerous. It was dangerous for anyone to get away with saying that. Because since each of these statuses is partly the result of a practice or a performance or whatever we want to call it, of a particular status, it's dangerous to have somebody get away with that. Now, Cuban authorities didn't defer to the formalities of French abolition any more than the Jamaican authorities did, so reputation as a slave might, as we saw yesterday with Sanitte, become legal recognition as a slave. So Adélaïde immediately took action and created a scandal that people remembered almost a decade later, which is why I know about it, because they talked about it in a lawsuit. She grabbed Mimi Boulard, and I don't know if she really grabbed her. She had her go with her to the lieutenant governor's office. I'm assuming that Adélaïde was also proffering that document, that she was waiving the receipt, the original, which I believe at this point she had, waiving the receipt of this document, right, which has that phrase, pour avoir acheté sa liberté. So she goes to the lieutenant governor and she says, you've got to make Mimi Boulard stop saying this. Well, I try to imagine the Spanish lieutenant governor of Baracoa, these 2 women come barreling up to his office, right? And they say, she called me a slave, make her stop. So we don't know quite what he did, but whatever he did, whether he looked at the document, he told Mimi Boulard to knock it off, stop calling Adélaïde a slave, and would you both please go home, right? So in a sense, she's suffered the reputational risk, and then in a kind of honor sense, she's forced Mimi to back down. So now, it's worth noting how complicated the question of her legal status is. Her neighbors could see that she was living as a free woman. They knew that she had been a slave back in Saint-Domingue, right? Some of them had not, some of them had, but they knew she had been. They probably knew, some of them, that she didn't have notarized manumission papers, but they certainly by now knew that she had this very important receipt. And maybe somebody knew what had happened in Kingston. Maybe somebody knew that for a moment she'd been inscribed as a slave. So Adélaïde was a certain kind of free woman, one whose continued liberty rested on a piece of unofficial paper and a kind of legal blur about the transformations in status that had accompanied the Haitian Revolution. A certain amount of inquiry could work in her favor, and the receipt from Charles Métayer was an important asset. Further inquiry might work against her. Now, sometimes people ask me at this point, couldn't she just have invoked abolition in Saint-Domingue? I think someone actually asked this also yesterday about Sanitte, and the answer would be the same. If you're going to try to get that lieutenant governor in on your side as against Mimi Boulard, you don't at the same time try to get the Spanish colonial governor to recognize the legitimacy of the uprising of slaves on the Northern Plain in 1791 and Toussaint Louverture and the French National Assembly. You don't want to try to do that because he will never agree to that proposition. So it's not the kind of claim she could make. She was better off with her handwritten receipt. So what's the next moment that status comes into question? The baby's born. She was pregnant when she arrived. The baby's born. They go to, she and Monsieur Bernoulli go to baptize the child, and the priest asks her if she has proof of her free status. Now, at this point, nobody's claiming to own her. The priest is just doing what he's actually sort of obligated by law to do. He's only supposed to baptize a child of color as free if he has ascertained that the mother is free. The womb has to be free for the child to be born free. So she shows her receipt, and the priest says, okay, and he baptizes the little girl, Belle, as free. But he urges Adélaïde and her partner to have this receipt somehow certified, to make it stronger. A year later, she has another child. The drama kind of repeats itself at the baptism of the second daughter, Bélise. This time, the parents take the advice about certification. The way they did it was kind of interesting. They learned that there was a privateering ship in the harbor at Baracoa. It was owned by a Monsieur Chevalier, and on board were two men who had known Charles Métayer back in Le Cap. So they go out to the boat with the receipt, with the signature, and have these two respectable men who had known Charles Métayer certify that that was indeed Charles Métayer's signature. So they've taken the fragile, unnotarized document, and they've notched it up with some counter signatures. Now, this way, the document is being seen and authorized by two people. Those two people later on, they end up being tracked down in the United States. One of them recalls it as having been a document of the consensual sale by Charles Métayer of Adélaïde to herself. So he remembers it as a sale document, and the other one remembers it as a declaration of liberty. So it's sort of indicative of how complicated this document is. Now, in addition to the quarrelsome neighbors and the inquisitive priest, I think it's possible that Adélaïde Métayer was a little nervous about descendants of her prior owners. The son, I believe both of the senior Métayers have now passed on, but the son is just down in Santiago, and he starts making inquiries. And a woman named Daïne makes inquiries and returns to Pierre Métayer and says, well, yes, Adélaïde is here in Cuba. She's living as a free woman up in Baracoa. And at this point, Pierre Métayer doesn't do anything. He's busy trying to find a way to get to New York himself. So he doesn't do anything, which is relevant. So far, Adélaïde's strategies are working. And when her neighbors talked about this later in retrospect, they said Adélaïde always enjoyed her freedom in Baracoa. Elle y était fort à son aise. She was very much at ease there. So she'd worked things out in the small community of Baracoa. But Napoleon is really the villain of this story. 1808, Napoleon, right? He invades the Iberian Peninsula, which flings France and Spain into war, which means that all of the Saint-Domingue refugees who are in Baracoa, Santiago, Havana are now nationals of an enemy power of the colonial power of Spain. So they're all going to get expelled because they're a security risk. They're viewed as French. So Adelaide and her now 3 children end up in another forced migration, this one to Louisiana. Now, it's interesting to ask, and again, we had this picture yesterday of people coming down the gangway in New Orleans. So while in Cuba, she's backed down anybody who tried to call her a slave. She's now got these children. She lands in New Orleans. As far as we can tell, she lands as a free woman of color. That is the category to which I believe the mayor would have, the category he would have attributed to her, and she settles into the community of Saint-Domingue refugees. Now, here we begin to get to the part of the story where there's a lot of gossip, because when you use lawsuits from trial courts, you get a lot of gossip. So not everything that is said is actually true, but here's the kind of picture we have. A community of refugees, 8,000, 9,000 people, but many of whom already know each other, either from Baracoa or from back in Saint-Domingue. And she crosses paths with a man named Louis Noret. I'll refer to him just as the tailor Noret. He was her former owner's former business partner. And how should I put this? He befriended her. Now, if you listen to the woman named Pouponne Guérin says, oh, he more than befriended her, right? So the gossips imply that eventually they came to be living in concubinage, as the term would have been used at the time. But you know, we don't really know. And so Noret has befriended Adelaide. She finds a place to live. And Noret persuades her that she should give the original of this document to him for safekeeping. Yeah. There it goes. Adelaide, don't do it, right? Now, in her defense, it would have made a certain amount of sense, because if anything happened to her, her best bet would have been for a white Frenchman to take a document to a court and say, wait, you've made a mistake, right? You grabbed Adelaide as a slave, but here, let me show you, with his credibility as a white Frenchman, her freedom papers. So I think she thought that she was actually being prudent, that it would be safer for him to have it than for her to have it. But I can tell from the groan in the audience that you already anticipate that it was a bad decision. So you will recall that, from yesterday's discussion, that given the ban on the international trade in captives and the introduction into the United States of persons to be held as slaves, right, the federal law that had already passed in 1807, gone into effect in 1808, and we're now in 1809. So you'll recall that it required congressional action and presidential remissions of penalties to lift that ban such that persons could be introduced as slaves, right? So on March 16th, 1810, after that presidential set of remissions have begun, the Territorial Council of Louisiana passes a resolution that all rights attaching to ownership may now be exercised over the slaves who were brought in from Saint-Domingue. On that very day, the tailor Noret walks down to the court, Louis Moreau-Lillet's court, and says the following: I was owed a debt back in Saint-Domingue by the Métayer family. I now do not have, I can't reach any member of the Métayer family. I want a court order to allow me to seize any property of the Métayer family that might be present in this jurisdiction in order to cover my debt. Louis Moreau-Lillet, the judge, says, sure, sounds right to me, right? So the tailor Noret, accompanied by the sheriff, go to Adelaide's house and seize her and her 3 children and incarcerate them. And then they put an ad in the newspaper announcing that she and her 3 children will be sold at auction on the steps of the Café de la Bourse in order to repay the debt as per the adjudication of the court. And that ad runs, you can go, I went and found the Moniteur de la Louisiane, and I sort of watched this coming, every 2 days or so. The ad runs in the paper announcing to people that this is going to happen. At almost the last minute, Adélaïde is able to find a lawyer. And the lawyer comes forward and proffers a copy of this document. Now, as you can imagine, Noré's lawyer then says, "That's a forgery," to which he says, "Yes, because you stole the original." So they bring a copy of this document. That's how we have it in the record. And they try to get people to say that although this is not the original, it is the same content as the original. So the judge then postpones the sale pending the adjudication of this question of her freedom. But, and now you remember the awkward feature of this document. What about the little boy? How old is he? Well, it's 1810, and this is dated 1801. So Adelaide first tries to say he's 9 years old. She tries to make it be the case that this had already been in effect when he was born, in which case he'd be free. But neighbors come in, and the people are skeptical and say, no, he's 11. He was born before this was signed. And so the judgment of the court is that Adélaïde and her daughters will be incarcerated until the case can be adjudicated, but that the little boy will be sold on the steps of the Café de la Bourse to the highest bidder, which he was. Now, oddly enough, Noré, in his complicated effort to try and do this, has set the amount of the debt that he alleged sufficiently low that the sale of that child covers the debt. And once the sale of that child covers the whole debt, in other words, if you come in and say, I'm owed 125 piastres, and if the little boy yields 130 at auction, then the debt's paid. And then the court case collapses. There's nothing more to adjudicate. The debt's gone. It's been paid. So Adélaïde and the 2 little girls are released. No adjudication is made about her status. It's just that the case that was going to cause her to be sold is over. And so she goes home. And it's interesting that at this point, she stops using the surname Métayer. She's been referred to in court documents as Adélaïde Métayer, but I think for good reason, she no longer wants even to associate her name with that family. She starts referring to herself as Adélaïde Durand. And the next child that she has, and I may even have a picture of the baptismal record. I found the baptismal record. I'd looked and looked, and then I had the idea, of looking. It's not all that easy to read this document, but you can see up there in the middle, Adélaïde Durand. So the next time that she baptizes a child, she baptizes that child with her name being Adélaïde Durand. So she's depicted in this baptismal certificate as a free woman of color. But the tailor Noré was not finished. He now contacted, and people sometimes ask me, like, what's with this guy? I don't know. I don't know what combination of sheer greed, there's a lot of potential value in persons if you can construe them as property, vengeance, domestic violence, vindictiveness, retaliation. I don't know what motivates this man, and no one really speculates. But he goes and he finds Pierre Métayer up in New York and gets Pierre Métayer to sign up a power of attorney to Noré down in New Orleans to file suit to recuperate the property in Adélaïde and her whole family by descent from the original ownership relation that the Métayers had over Adélaïde. Now, by this point, I guess, and I will go through the legal proceedings fairly quickly in order to get to the interpretive part at the end. So, it's 7 lawsuits in all, and it makes her life, Adélaïde's life, a series of what her friends call misères, miseries. They seize her, they release her, they seize her again. She has the nursing baby, and the lawsuit cranks through. She now did have enough of a network of acquaintances within the community that she was able to find a lawyer, she was able to find witnesses, and at every point she tried to challenge the claims of Louis Noré and Pierre Métayer. Now, she made a double argument, because by this point she absolutely had to claim that she was free, because since the claim to her was being made by inheritance, it was no longer enough that the debt had been paid to Noré. It was now inheritance through the Métayer family. So she brought in witnesses to say that she'd always been free in Baracoa, that everybody knew her to be free. So she's making a social fact argument. And in terms of doctrine, as these cases wind through, she finds an attorney who makes the following argument, that as the result of the passage of time during which the Métayers had failed to claim her as a slave, they had lost any right to use the law to seize her as property. That's the civil law concept of prescription. It's not unlike the common law concept of adverse possession. A certain amount of time in which one doesn't exercise one's rights as an owner can lead to their extinction. Now, here's the difficulty. She has to argue that she engaged in a kind of continuous, uninterrupted, and public kind of occupancy of her own self, right? That she was occupying herself in the way that in a land dispute, you would be occupying land that previously belonged to someone else. But the civil laws of Louisiana did not call for any possibility of freedom by prescription. In other words, she's trying to argue that the proprietor over herself has lost that claim because she has become the proprietor of her own self. But nowhere in the Civil Code of Louisiana does it specify that freedom by prescription is possible. But her attorney comes up with the following. Here's how the argument goes. Underneath the civil law of Louisiana as a state is the civil law of Louisiana as a territory. Underneath the civil law of Louisiana as a territory is the civil law of Louisiana as a French colony. And underneath the law of Louisiana as a French colony is the law of Louisiana as a Spanish colony. And that for any law that has not been specifically superseded by one of those higher levels, the lower one is still in effect. The 13th century Siete Partidas of King Alfonso the Wise did allow for freedom by prescription. Yeah, I know, good lawyer, right? So he stands there in court and he says that we know from the Siete Partidas that 10 years of living as free in good faith in the presence of the master, or 20 years living as free in good faith in a country other than that of the master, confers freedom. Now, the trial court, which has a jury of 10 white men, rules in her favor. Now, I don't know whether it's that they're persuaded by the Siete Partidas of Alfonso the Wise, or whether they simply view her as a free woman of color whom this guy, Noré, just keeps grabbing, right? We don't know, but they rule in her favor. So immediately, of course, Noré appeals it, and he appeals it to the Louisiana Supreme Court. Louisiana Supreme Court takes a look at the case, says they're not very interested in that paper of liberty. They don't think that it has any particular power to free her. They make no reference to abolition in Saint-Domingue, but they do conclude that as of 1801, yeah, she could live in good faith as free because she has this document that says liberté. But then they, count on their fingers, and it only comes to 17 years, and the master wasn't here, so you'd have to make 20, and you didn't make 20. So she's a slave. So, wait, it keeps going. So they rule in favor of Noré acting as attorney for Pierre Métayer. So then Pierre Métayer tries to actually go get her, tries to seize her, tries to take possession of this property that he's been alleging. And he can't do it. I don't know why he can't do it. If I were writing this as a movie script, right, it would be the neighbors who wouldn't let him get it. He'd throw tomatoes at him. I don't know. Anyway, he can't do it. So he goes to court and says to the court, she refuses to deliver up herself as my slave. You've got to help me. So I want a court order that will help me force her to deliver herself up as my slave. So again, the thing goes to trial court. Again, the jury says, she's free, right? And in fact, the judge issues a rather strong statement that the law should protect her and her children in the enjoyment of their freedom. Again, it goes to the Supreme Court. This time, a different justice of the Supreme Court looks at this and says, well, this is nugatory. This doesn't have any effect. But, he says, it's 1818, he says, but you know, in 1794, slavery was abolished in Saint-Domingue, Haiti. Now, he doesn't recognize that as causing anybody to be free, but it's a reasonable point from which to start counting the years under which she lived as in good faith as free, and that way it comes to more than 20. And so she is declared free. Now, at this point, we might ask, I realize I'm going to go from the story to the analysis, right? I hate to let go of the drama of the story for a moment, but here's how would we interpret this then? That by 1818, by the end of 1818, the woman who now is calling herself Adélaïde Durand was free in fact and free in law. In struggling over decades to prevent the powers attaching to a right of ownership from being exercised over her, so here's that arcane phrase, exercising the powers that attach to ownership, she'd stopped anybody from doing that, and thereby, to some extent, made her own freedom, performed or practiced the thing that would be recognized as freedom. She could only do that, of course, because of the legal and practical freedom that had accompanied the Haitian Revolution. And the legal basis of her claim, the demonstration that she'd acted as occupant and possessor of her own self, was one that could not be made by the other 3,000 people judged to be, by the 3,226 persons judged to be slaves, because of course, once they were judged to be slaves on arrival in New Orleans, then no prescriptive clock is running. Someone is exercising ownership over them, so they're not gaining years in the way that she was toward eventual freedom. So once those powers were exercised over those other 3,000 persons, then the presumption of genuine ownership follows. But now, remember Kingston. In addition to struggling to keep out of the clutches of Louis Noré, Adélaïde also, I think, had to keep a secret. She had to keep the secret of those months back in Kingston in 1803, 10 years into what had to be a 20-year uninterrupted period of living as free. Those moments when she was inscribed as a slave on the list submitted to Governor Nugent. She hadn't really, it seems, managed to live openly and uninterruptedly as a free woman. A member of the Métayer family had, at that moment in 1803, reasserted the right to claim ownership over her, and the relevant colonial authorities had accepted that assertion. Now, I should say that when I came across that entry in Governor Nugent's papers, which was just last March, I'd already developed almost the whole interpretation of the story of Adélaïde Métayer, and suddenly here was this inscription at the midpoint. I have to admit, I felt a little bit ill at the realization that her case wasn't what it was in some sense founded on this concealment of a fact. And I think that part of what had happened to me as a researcher is that I had begun to blur in my mind the difference between uncovering the story and actually litigating the case. Ani Guinier said to me yesterday, "Excuse me, but wasn't the case over 200 years ago?" And I said, well, yes, but that doesn't actually inoculate the researcher against the kind of illusion that if they could make the case, if they could strengthen it. So here I'll make a 1-minute parenthesis about archives. The historian Arlette Farge, in that exquisite little book called The Allure of the Archives, warns us of the traps that the archive sets. Here's what she says in this new English translation. Translator's right here in the room, but I won't point a finger at him. But it's a beautiful translation. So here's what Farge says. When traveling this unmarked trail, you must always guard yourself against the persistent temptation to identify with the characters, the situations, and the ways of thinking and being that are in the documents. Now, she doesn't mean you shouldn't identify. She means you'd better be careful when you start to identify, because the way of thinking, which in this case is the law of prescription, it's right there. She says a passion for the archives is not an exemption from its pitfalls. So I think I had fallen pretty thoroughly into one of those archival traps. Over several years, I'd carefully constructed in my mind Adelaide's argument for freedom by prescription, right down to locating the relevant lines in medieval Spanish and the early editions of the Siete Partidas. So here's what I've come to realize after this, the Kingston trauma. That trying to sort out in purely legal terms any of these cases of status determination sends us down a kind of rabbit hole of uncertainties, because we start thinking as though there is some real status that inheres in the person, some fact of the matter about whether this person really is free or really is slave. But if there is no solid root of title to property in persons in the first place, then it's hardly surprising that there's no clear fact of the matter when someone tries to argue that a given title is faulty. In this case, that it is Adélaïde Durand who should be viewed as possessing and occupying herself, showing that evidence of non-ownership on the part of the heirs of Charles Métayer. So then I also began to wonder, does what Madame Métayer told the committee that was reporting to Governor Nugent, does it actually trump Adélaïde's later claims? Had Adélaïde actually ceased asserting herself to be a free woman? Did she even know that Madame Métayer was making this representation in front of a British official? In the final analysis, I realized the problem is not really our lack of documents, although of course I'm always going to go try to find more documents. It goes deeper. In the diaspora of the Haitian Revolution, status as a slave was radically indeterminate, something that could be claimed and refuted, written and effaced, alleged and argued over, all the while being treated by the legal authorities of the slaveholding jurisdictions as if it were a natural and self-evident fact about the person. So in practice, Adélaïde Métayer-Durand did succeed in silencing her apparent reversion to slave status in Kingston. By the time she reached Baracoa just a few months later, she was able to back down her neighbor Mimi Boulard, who dared to call her a slave. And in New Orleans in 1810, if there were any who knew, they weren't saying. So here's my hunch, is that in 1803 in Kingston, Adélaïde may have momentarily slipped back into and then quickly clambered back up from the category slave. And again, and I can't let go of this feeling of litigating the case, and a good lawyer might be able to argue that a sufficiently brief interruption does not actually interrupt, I don't know exactly, but I think you can. I think you can in cases of adverse possession. That there was a brief interruption, it was fleeting enough not to constitute a challenge to her claim of freedom by prescription. But that's just me falling back into the trap. The main point lies elsewhere. Between the social facts and the legal fictions lay the life itself, characterized by Adélaïde's unending effort to maneuver within a world of shifting jurisdictions and to fend off the multiple risks entailed in the threat, the reality, or the appearance of being a person who could be held as property. And in that effort, the doctrine of prescription came to her aid. Tomorrow, in the final lecture, I will move about 40 years further forward to the eve of the U.S. Civil War. I'll take my distance from the Haitian diaspora, but stay within the Mississippi Valley. And I'll explore another case in which another woman sought to use the doctrine of prescription to hold on to her freedom. Eulalie Oliveau, her 6 children, and her 11 grandchildren were kidnapped around 1852 in Pointe-Coupée Parish, Louisiana, and taken for sale in the slave markets of New Orleans and Mobile. They managed to find an attorney, and they would reach for that same doctrine of prescription. But by the time their case reached the Louisiana Supreme Court, it's 1856. The stakes for Louisiana's legal system, indeed for the law of slavery across the whole country, were getting very high. And it was not at all clear whether one could still use that ancient doctrine to force open the door to recognition of the legal validity of one's social identity as a free person. Thank you. And we have time for questions, and Abby will deliver microphones to people who wish to ask questions.
No? Okay, questions, comments. That was another tour de force.
Or advice about where to find crucial documents. Tamara Herzog, with whom I've been
Yes.
discussing the doctrine of prescription. So, yeah.
But actually, I wasn't going there. I was going to something else that you mentioned about status being a question of reputation and performance. I think this is, obviously, you convinced me completely that it's true about slavery, but it's true about status in general in this period. You didn't have, in a sense, that you could have an official recognition that you were noble, but noble was a matter of status and performance. You could have an official recognition that you were a citizen, what I studied, but it was based on performance and reputation. So I think your argument, which is completely convincing about slavery, actually goes much further. It goes to the question of what is status in the early modern period or in the early 19th century? And is it what we have imagined it to be, or is it something completely different? And we've been, in a sense, so I would take your argument further on and question status in general, not just slavery.
That seems correct to me. It goes beyond the scope of my documents, because status in the whole early modern period is bigger than I can wrap my arms around. But it seems, I guess I'd say two things. What you're saying seems entirely correct, and I can think of instances closer to these in which the same argument would be made. For example, some of you who've read Freedom Papers know about the moment when Édouard Tinchon, the grandson of Rosalie of the Poulard Nation, was shoved off a streetcar by, he was a Union soldier, he was in uniform, and a white Union soldier shoved him off the streetcar. And he immediately protested to it, Édouard Tinchon, protested to his commanding officer. And I think it's partly the kind of thing you're describing. Now, the status he was asserting was not whiteness. He viewed himself as a son of Africa. But the status he was asserting was a Union soldier who deserved respect on the streetcars of the city of New Orleans. And he could not allow the affront to go unchallenged. And he uses the hierarchy of the military, one of the relatively few institutions where you actually immediately have somebody you can go to higher up than the person who just affronted you. So that seems correct. The twist would be that, of course, status as a slave has this very particular, I mean, it's probably not unique, but once you're in it, then reputational evidence may not let you ever get out again, right? So because it has this capacity to turn you into a commodity, it isn't exactly a two-way street. But I'm sure you'll tell me that that's true of lots of statuses, that if you're a fallen woman, you don't pull yourself up out of that. Yeah.
And actually, it's interesting that you talk about the violence in which he reacts against the affront to his status. So there goes prescription too, in a sense, because reputation and performance is a way to act in a way that might constitute a right to this status, right? So if somebody questions your right, you have to react violently, or else you consented to the challenge on your status. So it goes back to the rationale not only of performance, therefore status, but also performance, there, so the ability to say that I've performed so long that I have prescription and therefore I have status. So it's like what we spoke before about possession. It's both a proof of and a way to constitute status. So of course you have to react violently to any attempt against your pretension to have a certain status that you might not have yet, but you will have because people would recognize you as belonging.
Yeah, I think that it's a very interesting way of putting it, and I think the idea also of the number of years that we conceive of as securing one's status. So you were telling me that one can secure one's status as citizen after a certain number of years, which may be the same 10 that works for prescription as against slavery. So I think it's a very interesting point, and it's also relevant to things like the decision by the committee to challenge the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act in Louisiana to persuade Homer Plessy to get on the streetcar and subject himself to the humiliation of being ejected, because as a community, the community needed to challenge that forced segregation the minute it had happened, even though they might not win the suit. So I think that sounds like an important dynamic to identify. So we'll go back and forth between the two sides of the room. Yeah.
Just a quick, again, not a question so much as a comment. First of
Yeah.
all, it's incredible to me that these people knew 200 years ago, sort of had an internal fight for their own dignity. I think that that's just mind-boggling. And I remember reading some slave narrative, and slave was sort of enslaved person was asked to do something for himself, and the comment was, "Ain't got no self," and just the idea that he did not own his own being was incredible. But one thing I want to comment on is this really reminds me of a lot of sort of, we talk about street cred of, people in prison and that draw the line mentality of, if they get away with something, you're a goner. And it sounds like almost there's a survival mechanism that they know instinctually that they have to draw the line in a really strong, quick way. And it's just the similarities are really incredible for me. Thank you for this really fascinating presentation.
And thank you for that observation, because when I think the fact that we have the description of the confrontation between Adelaide and Mimi, and then Adelaide insisting on taking it up a notch, I think is vivid proof that she can't let that word lie out there unchallenged, because this is Cuba. Plenty of people are held as slaves. Somebody could turn up, and she would be in trouble. Yep. Was there a question over on this side?
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I was taken by the story about her son, and I'm curious as to whether or not you've done any follow-up research on him and any legal maneuvers to set him free. And I was also curious as to the legal status, where he was born, and what the laws were where he was born.
That question has kept me awake at night. I would, whatever it is that one is willing to give up in order to find that document in the archives, I wouldn't quite give up my firstborn or my secondborn, but, I would really like to find evidence. Now, I only found that name Alzire in March in Jamaica. So now what I need to do is go back to Louisiana, armed with that unusual first name, and see whether conceivably that will enable me to find a child tumbled into the New Orleans slave market. Without the first name, and given that as an enslaved person he would have had no surname, and that the person who purchased him could change his name, there was originally, for the first couple of years that I was doing research on this, there was no way to find him. And he was sold at auction, which means there's no notarized bill of sale. If it had been a notarized bill of sale, I could have rolled up my sleeves and looked at every notarial record for that whole string of months. It's doable. But there's no notarized bill of sale. It's just the sheriff. The sheriff just authorizes it. So I tried to find the sheriff's records. Those haven't survived. And I share your eagerness to find out. Now, so here we get into the speculative. I do know that in other cases, well, this is a case that we'll talk about tomorrow, when someone purchases a person whose status they know to be disputed in some way, in Louisiana, characteristically what they will do is resell them deeper into slavery, further away. So my terrible fear, you can tell that I can't get over it. It's 200 years ago, but it's still, my fear is that to the extent that Adelaide was known to be very determined, but at this moment she's in jail, that whoever bought the little boy, let's assume he's named Alzire, may have, it's not that big a city. I mean, it's a big city, but it's not anonymous, may have resold him, further out of her reach. Maybe not. I mean, again, we're sort of writing the movie in our minds here. Sometimes with sales at auction, someone comes and makes the purchase in order to return the foreclosed object sold at auction, right? And in this case, it's a foreclosed child sold at auction. Conceivably, someone actually had the money and would keep that child out of further harm's way, but I don't see any evidence of that. And one difficulty is that while Métayer is a somewhat rare name, so I can brute force my way into finding every Métayer recorded in any way in Louisiana, Durand in French is like Smith. It's everywhere. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So trying to track him based on maybe his having one day become free and use the name Durand. But I'm not going to, as I said yesterday, I'm not actually going to sign the contract for the book and agree to turn the book in at a certain date until I either find some trace of him or conclusively decide that it can't be found. Now, where was he born? I don't know whether he was born in New York or whether he was born in Le Cap. I don't think he was born in New York. I think he's more likely to have been born in Le Cap. But whichever way, he was born free. So this is the other thing. That child is like Sanitte. He's a free-born child. They're inferring back that he's a slave because if you take this to be the moment that she became free, right, then anything preceding it would be, she would be a slave. But actually, under French colonial law, she was free before 1801. She was free as soon as she landed on the shore. And under New York law, any time after 1799, a child born to someone who's a slave is born free. But it would be, I mean, I kind of specialize in needles and haystacks, but this is like needle in a barn full of haystacks. But it could be found. Often what happens is that somebody hears the story and then they're doing genealogy or something and they say, oh wait, here's something, and they send me an email saying, you better go look at this list that we just turned up somewhere. So it's a collective effort. Some of the things in Freedom Papers, Perfect Strangers wrote to me saying, I think I found one of your members of the National family. So another, we got time for another question too? Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing this story. It's such a good one, even if it is anxiety-provoking.
Yeah.
My question is about the citizenship of non-whites leaving Saint-Domingue, Haiti. It seems that everybody is wanting to refer to them as French, and I have seen everybody referring to them as French except the French and themselves. So I'm wondering, have you seen how they refer to their own citizenship if they acquire citizenship either in Cuba or in the US? And I imagine that the story is very different in Jamaica, Cuba, and New Orleans, as opposed to up the east coast of the US. So in this situation, what is their citizenship, or does it change?
Julia Gatfield, great question, hard to answer. So let me give you a couple pieces of an answer. As you know, although the term citoyen, citoyenne is a key term of the French Revolution, it's not a term that is systematically defined in the US Constitution. So as for people arriving in Louisiana, it's interestingly complicated, and I'll give you an example of how complicated it is. The question of referring to people as Haitian, which we do begin to see, which you begin to see in Jamaica after 1810 or so, I don't find that in New Orleans in this period. It's pretty much Saint-Domingue all the way. Réfugiés de Saint-Domingue. The term French, as in French slaves or black French women, those you find in Cuba. You find it as a generic descriptor in the United States, the term French Negroes, as Ashley White and others, Sarah Johnson, have written about. But in New Orleans itself, everybody knows the place was called Saint-Domingue. And so they refer to people as being from Saint-Domingue. Now, although, I should say, after a certain point, continuing to call it Saint-Domingue, like by the time you get to 1820, there's something sort of absurd about calling it Saint-Domingue, right? It becomes almost a political act. To refer to it as Saint-Domingue is to say, that place we're going to get back one of these days, right? So the widow Aubert, who is the godmother of the child named Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Rosalie. I know I sound like a little old lady on the front porch explaining all the genealogy. But the widow Aubert, when she supervises the wedding, the marriage of her godchild, she says, I have been like a mother to her, this is 1822, been like a mother to her since her, youngest age. Her actual mother still lives in Saint-Domingue. 1822, still lives in Saint-Domingue. There is no Saint-Domingue. But that's the way the widow Aubert, who'd been a property holder and a slave holder in Saint-Domingue, avoids saying the word Haiti. Now, on citizenship, I'm looking at John Stauffer because I've got a nifty example here that I'm hoping to bring to light. The US Constitution doesn't define citizenship. It doesn't even use the word all that much. But as you recall, the US government was very concerned in the early part of the 19th century that the British not impress sailors who were US citizens into British service. You remember the way this goes, that the British said, you know, you're really still British, we can grab you, and the US said, no, they're not, they're American citizens. Okay, so now, New Orleans. The Treaty of Cession, by which the Louisiana Territory became part of the United States, says that all residents of the territory shall enter into the rights and privileges of US citizenship. It has no color terms in there. So, a sailor who's a man of color, who needs his certificate showing his US citizenship so that he can ship out on a boat and have that to protect himself against British impressment, he needs to go to Governor Claiborne, the same egregious Governor Claiborne, or he needs to go to a notary, one of these same egregious notaries who are processing people the way that they are, and get them to certify that he was already resident there prior to 1803 and hence is a US citizen. So I've gone down through those Seamen's Protection certificates, and sure enough, you can find the notaries and the governors signing right off on US citizenship for free men of color. Take that, Justice Taney and Dred Scott, right? It's a nice example where, under their own logic, the interests of the state now override any reluctance to use the valuable term citizen to apply to a person of color. I think the term isn't all that valuable, but it's very valuable to a sailor at that point. And so they go ahead and certify this. So it's interesting to ask how that happened, how that works out. Now, we could say then that the sailor who has that Seamen's Protection certificate, and you'll recall that when Frederick Douglass escaped, what he used was a borrowed Seamen's Protection certificate. Lo, these many years later, yeah, it's kind of nice, isn't it? So for the person who's got it, it may be as useful as a claim of freedom as it is as a claim of citizenship. Sailors tended not to be too particular about their citizenship, right? Depending on the legal consequences of having one or another citizenship, given whatever you were engaged in. So it's not a full answer to your question, but your question is one I'll try and keep in mind as I look at new documents to see how people are referred to. It's a very interesting question.
Thank you.
And of course, the nomenclature and the citizenship are somewhat separable. Good. One more question. Is there? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting exposition. What I wanted to know is how the patterns of performance changed with the abolition. What does abolition mean, in fact? You talked about
Abolition in Saint-Domingue.
Yeah. Abolition. You said that people were the people who formerly were slaves then could go to the city freely, but I suppose I am studying Brazilian history, and even slaves could work as day laborers or sell fruits or whatsoever, but even though they belong to a master. So I would like you to develop a little bit on how these patterns, from which you then can say, oh, it's a free man or not, how they changed. I mean, all of them were free, of course, but if they performed like being like before, did they really? I mean, and is not it the second thing, the liberation in liberté in that document? Is it not a performance of a slave to buy his liberté? Why did she buy her liberté? I really, even, you explained it, but I really didn't understand what she bought, what she paid for. Isn't it just the old pattern of being a slave? That's my question.
Okay, this is a big, complicated question, so I'll try and give it a fairly short answer so that I can liberate you all to have wine and cheese. But let me try and answer it because it's a good, hard question. The first part is really a question for specialists in Haitian social history who will need to help us figure out what are the components, what are the degrees of freedom, what are the pieces of freedom that people enjoy, and that's the word that's often used as a technical term, in post-emancipation Haiti. And we could probably discern some of this by seeing conflicts over what someone's entitled to do and what they're not entitled to do. So after she has this piece of paper and she then goes to work as a marchande in Port-de-Paix, she's clearly opened up a distance between herself and the persons who used to have a very direct, intimate control over her. So big question, you have 500,000 people who move from the status of slave to the status of legal freedom. And I mean, my general answer would be that we're probably going to see a huge range from people who are held to work still on a plantation, but with a different sense of their working hours and what they can be made to do, to at another end, people who begin to move around completely freely, much more freely than an enslaved woman going to market. Now, on the question, you were asking about the performance of freedom in Saint-Domingue, and then the question of why she does this. Well, again, there's probably no legal fact of the matter, but I think if we envision her circumstance, she has been told by the people who surround her master and mistress, her former master, former mistress, the people in whose household she's serving, that she has to have a carte de sûreté to prove who her employer is as a domestic, or she has to have some form of proof of who she is. She needs some kind of identity card or she can't leave. So to be an undocumented woman of color when there's a regime of required labor papers, it's a kind of South African regime, you have to show, that's probably an injudicious thing to say, but it's a regime in which in order to move around as a worker, you have to show, it's like Puerto Rico after 1870, you have to show who your employer is. So I think she's trying to buy her way into a greater degree of capacity to separate herself from the household in which she's lived all of her life. Now, whether that's, we can't, you're right that if it were all before a court, she'd already be free, so what would be the point of the liberté? But I think it's best understood with relation to the labor certificates, that she's trying to have a piece of paper, so if someone stops her and says, hey, wait a second, aren't you someone's servant? What are you doing here in Port-de-Paix? Aren't you from Cap Français? Then she can show the document. I see an uncertain look. I'm going to take one more question then, because I see a look of uncertainty in your eyes. Let Abby give you because they're taping. This is the translator of Arlette Farge that I'm going to give the game away. Okay, yeah.
So post-revolution in Haiti, how were the pass card requirements applied? So it's probably the case that not every single person who was a slave pre-revolution has to be the pass card requirement. So like Toussaint, for example, is not going to be required to show a pass card at all times. So was there any framework for opting out of it, or for who has these requirements and who does not?
Excellent question. When I found this passage about the carte de sûreté, I wrote to Laurent Dubois and I said, can we figure out how this worked? And his answer was, we have a reasonable idea of how some of these things functioned on plantations, to the extent that we have plantation records, but there's no centralized repository of material that will really tell us how it happened in the city. So my answer to your question, Thomas, would be completely speculative, but it would probably go back to the points that have been made here about practices and performances, that there are probably ways of comporting oneself as if long free, and there are probably people whose dress, demeanor, resources convey that sense, whether they actually are long free or not, and that may be part of how they opt out. I'd guess that men who've done military service, that the military service is a pretty good opt-out, right? You don't exactly ask someone for papers if they're armed and in uniform, right? So, but I think it's a good question of the social history of Haiti, and not an easy one to answer, which is why we go back to the archives. But I agree with you. There's a little uncertainty because that's why, in a sense, the comparison with South Africa is silly, because South Africa has a regime of a truly totalizing state, and it persuaded the Polaroid land camera company here in Boston in 1970 to give them the early photographic passcard, suitcase-sized passcard makers. I remember, because I remember the demonstration out in front of the Polaroid land company when I was here as an undergraduate. So they could do something like that, line everybody up, take their picture, emboss it, and require them to carry it. But of course, you're perfectly right. 500,000 people move from one legal status to another. One can say carte de sûreté as much as one wants. It isn't all going to come into existence overnight. Thank you very much. Enjoy the discussion.